So what I'm going to go into today is how I understand the dimensions at the moment. Now going on from here, I'm going to go over some things that I've mentioned before. So here is Michael Lee Hill. He's a musician, a great guitarist. He's an experiencer as well. And I highly recommend checking out his website, michaelleehill.net. Now why I'm mentioning Michael is he had the scientist, this is from him, I had the scientist at Cymoscope image my guitar A note tuned to 432 Hertz. And this is what he got. So he recorded the A note, you know, Cymoscope, where they get geometry through sound. I believe this may have been through water, if I've got that correct, and then the light sort of highlighting the different geometry in that. So look at all the geometry there, and as I've mentioned, go right up the top, just below the red where the yellow is, and you can see zeros and ones, binary code. This is very similar. If you can imagine it fluctuating, it's hard to describe, but it's basically like a kaleidoscope like I've talked about. If you imagine a kaleidoscope that keeps going, it repeats the same geometry over and over. That's how a lot of these geometric light realms look like when I'm experiencing them. And then when you go to the right there, that's A in 440 Hertz, which is how most music is recorded these days. You can see it's not as organized. Now here's a real NASA photo of 432 Hertz water. I believe that's in infrared. And this is from Richard C. Hoagland and what he wrote about Michael Lee Hill. Michael Lee Hill's 432 Hertz based numerical values, which turn out to be the same key numbers marking the Earth's 25,920 year precessional cycle, and thus the same key numbers crucial to the cycle activation of hyperdimensional physics on Earth. Now when we talk about hyperdimensional physics of Earth, I'll just sort of like simplify it quickly. If the moon wasn't where it was compared to the Earth and from that distance to the sun, and with the moon going around the Earth, what happens is just the placement of those objects, Earth, the moon, and where the sun is, it opens up a gate for life to exist in the third dimensional state. If we didn't have the moon where it was, what would happen is we'd only have microbacterial life on the Earth, in the Earth. There would be no tides. So what happens is when the moon's brought here, it opens up that gate to happen, because otherwise you'd have 700 mile an hour winds, again, no tides, things like that, microbacterial life. Another interesting facts is when they landed on the moon, after enough missions, they were able to place seismographs around the moon, and they could basically get like a CAT scan of the moon. They were doing it for moonquakes, I believe it was. What they found 1,000 miles underneath the surface in the middle of the moon was geometric arc-shaped objects that aren't natural. So there was perfect geometry and pattern to it. And when they tried to get a core sample on the moon as well, which is interesting, underneath the surface, and they found it hard to actually try and put the tube in and get the core sample. It had shown that the moon had been exposed to a different star. So pretty interesting. Now from a conversation that Michael Lee Hill had with the scientists, this is what the scientists said about the 432 Hertz and their theory. It opens a portal through the fabric of space-time to bringing through energy from another dimension. That was the conclusion from the scientists. They found the 432 Hertz disk, which is this disk that is created from that image, will resurrect dead tap water into its original energetic blueprint. And he said, I asked her, where is this extra energy coming from? She answered, another dimension. And there's the image again. Isn't that quite amazing? For me it is anyway, because I've seen stuff like this so many times. I just want to show you quickly, and there's a reason for this as well. So just watch this. This is like basically a Cymoscope experiment. I'm not sure if it was Cymoscope doing this, but it's basically the same thing. I believe in this they've got sand on some type of, it could be a metal plate or something like that. And all they're doing is playing a sound through it, and it's creating perfect geometry. And all that was a tone, sand on that plate. They play the tone, and what you see is the sand changing form into geometric patterns. So sound changes with vibration or frequency. That's what we're seeing here. And this explains to me the geometric light realms, dimensions and interdimensional travel. There's also interplanes that I describe and talk about between each dimension, but we'll go more into this now as well. But first, I just want to put into your mind again, everything is consciousness, awareness, and from that you get sound, which gets light, and then from that you get matter. So it's all the same thing really. It's all coming from consciousness, awareness, which is why everything comes back down to consciousness. So here we see again from Stanford University, they're talking about sound giving birth to light. And as Albert Einstein said, we are slowed down sound and light waves, a walking bundle of frequencies tuned into the cosmos. We are souls dressed up in sacred biochemical garments, and our bodies are the instruments through which our souls play their music. Spot on. Now, here's just a quick example. I'm not saying this is exactly. I'm trying to get stuff from experiences and from the knowledge that I've got to articulate in a way that is understandable and sort of put into a way that's digestible as well. So, from my experience, what we've got is, imagine here we've got the 3D here on a line. Now, at the end of that line, it goes to that image there, which I took from the video you saw before, just as an example. So, in the third dimension, we've got one geometric frequency happening. Now, what happens from my experience is, in between each dimensions, there's an interplane, which is basically the same place in between each dimension. So you could go 3D, as you see here, interplane, 4D, interplane, 5D, interplane. So third dimension, interplane, fourth dimension, interplane, fifth dimensional, and so on and so on. It keeps repeating. So as you can see, what I'm trying to articulate here is that each dimension has its own geometry, its own frequency that it's operating on. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more in depth. So yes, there's a core frequency, but before it tunes up to go to the fifth dimension, yes, as I'm saying, there's an interplane in between each dimension, but there's, we could say, even frequencies within frequencies. So here, with the 4D, where the line was in the middle of that there, just underneath the 4D, now put all these other lines, which is symbolic of higher frequencies in the 4D and lower frequencies in the 4D. So this is where there could be beings that are in 3D, but we're not actually seeing them because they're not on the same frequency exactly as what we're on. They're just a little bit out or a little bit above, below or above. That's what's going on here from my understanding. And this is what happens throughout each dimension as well. So we hear about lower fourth dimensional astral beings, which are a lot of the time are reptilians or serpent type beings or certain type of negative greys. And what happens is, there's positive beings in the 4D as well, but as they go higher, you don't get those frequencies of lower energies in those high dimensions because they're not at the level of consciousness to obtain or interact or achieve going to those dimensions. Now, a cool thing to describe how the other dimensions and even when you're traveling look is this great video here. You may be able to find this on YouTube. I had this as a DVD. When I saw it, I was just like, this dude's tapped in. It's from the same guy that wrote The Keys of Enoch by J.J. Hurtak. So he did it with the bloke, Jean-Luc Bozzoli, I believe it's pronounced there. So this is something, if you type in that in YouTube, Merkaba, Voyage of a Starseed, there's geometry, there's traveling around. It's like you're going to other worlds and planets, so to speak. That's something I recommend to get an idea of what I'm talking about. And some of these realms do look animation-like. Like I described, this realm is more like a 70s colour television. It's not completely clear. There's a slight snow or haze to it. When you go to the other dimensions, things are a lot more refined. It's like 4K, 8K and beyond. It's so crystal clear. Different colours or different variations of colours that don't exist in our visible light spectrum here as well. And this is where a complicated, I guess, theory, but each thought that we make, and this is for every single soul on the planet, this is how convoluted all this gets. Every choice you make, you actually go with it, and the opposing choice that you had, you actually go with that in an offshoot as well. So not always, but it is possible. And this is where it's been shown to me how parallel universe exists. It's not just one or two parallel universes. Us independently through our choices does and can create other parallel universes on slightly off frequencies. I just hope this is understandable because it gets convoluted. Then there is what I talk about as an equivalent to a pop as an expression to go to source at any time. So within any frequency, there is like a master tone or master frequency that all frequencies emanate from originally. And when you're able to tap into that, and sometimes we just can't do it on demand or through intention, it just happens. It's like near-death experiences. They go into an interplane and there's even a pop that's associated with that when you're in that interplane, you're basically in a source type blueprint where all frequencies are available at the same time. That's what the interplane is. We go from one dimension, we pop into the interplane, and where we decide to go through that depends on which dimension we decide to go to, if that makes sense. So each dimension has its own frequency, but the interplane is like a master frequency that it's like the universal highway. In that interplane, you can go anywhere, but it all depends on your level of consciousness. Love is the key to access and go up the chain from what they've showed me. So there's a lot of talk about densities as well, because there's a lot of confusion. I'm going to explain this how I understand it. And it's not like there's people are mixing up dimensions with densities or vice versa. What's going on is I believe that densities have to do with the level of consciousness. So you can be in other dimensions, but again, depending on how high your consciousness is, and again, we could even say up to 11 dimensions have physical planets and stars. And as I've talked about, some planets will start to phase out, new ones appear in the next dimension. There could still be the same star. You go up, all of a sudden there's a new star. The other star that was there doesn't exist. There's a completely different star in a different spot. This is continuing to get convoluted, crazy, mixed up. Like, it's just mind-boggling what's going on, and this is what I experience a lot, and I experience a lot on the crafts or when I'm traveling. So when we look at this with the densities, my understanding is that densities are levels of consciousness. And again, the levels of consciousness are key. So there's levels of consciousness with dimensions, but within those dimensions, depending on the consciousness and how you're operating in that, depends on what you're able to access, what you're able to do. And there's different levels of it. So yeah, this is just an idea, and this is from the Law of One website, lawof1.info. I haven't read the Law of One. I know a little bit about it from what people have told me, but density, according to Ra, there are 7 densities in our octave of experience, and we currently inhabit the 3rd. Now, from what I had heard, I think there may even be an 8th, but this is what their website says. But I think there might be an 8th one, which is like when you're back at source, like you're unified with source again. So that would be what the yogis and lamas and the Tibetan teachings are talking about, is when you get to that peak pinnacle point where you lose all identification with yourself and you become not thinking about oneness, but you become the oneness with all that is. You reach that 8th level of density, which is God consciousness.